The Women's Parliament, sitting here in Cambridge on the 4th of March during International Women's Day celebration for the week, is now in session. The motion that we are addressing today is Beijing plus 30, Women's Rights, Government Responsibility, Parliamentary Action, a Women's Bill of Rights. This Women's Parliament, held in Cambridge, England on Tuesday the 4th of March during the United Nations International Women's Day Month of Action, 1. Notes that in 1995, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was agreed to and signed by 189 countries, including the United Kingdom, at the United Nations International Women's Conference in Beijing. 2. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action demands action by government signatories on 12 critical areas of concern, including 1. Women and poverty, 2. Education and training, 3. Women and health, 4. Violence against women, 5. Armed conflict, 6. Women and the economy, 7. Power and decision-making, 8. Institutional mechanisms, 9. Human rights, 10. Women and the media, 11. Women and the environment, and 12. The girl child. However, it being 30 years since the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action came into being, and despite some government action in some of these 12 critical areas of concern, A, poverty continues to wear a woman's face as it ever has. B, women do not have equal access to and opportunities in education and training, with the school curriculum, for example, weighted towards men's history and literature, men's achievements and sporting opportunities, and fewer opportunities for women and girls to identify and to build on career aspirations. C, differences in women's health warnings, for example, in relation to heart attacks, and failure to acknowledge and provide effective responses to women's pain are only now being recognised, together with acknowledgement of poor and oftentimes retrograde treatment of women in pregnancy, birthing, and pre- and postnatal care, and the wrongful dismissal of women's health conditions such as chronic fatigue syndrome, classified as a mental aberration too often. D, violence against women remains unabated and indeed seemingly accelerating. E, despite Security Council Resolution 1329 and CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that committee, General Recommendation 40, GR40, which ensures or is to ensure that women should be equal in power and decision-making. Despite this, armed conflicts continue globally without women's equal inclusion in diplomatic discussion and attempts at resolution before the conflict begins or is exacerbated, and to bring it to an end. F, women's economic participation continues whilst the pay gap and the pensions gap do not diminish. G, despite the increase of women in Parliament, women do not participate equally in decision-making at all levels in business, government, or the community. H, in 2010, the Women's National Commission, WNC, which provided advice to government, was abolished, and no institutional mechanisms exist for women's voice from civil society to be heard and policy formulation to be considered, much less adhered to by government. I, Albeit in 1995 in Beijing, the declaration that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights was affirmed as a key principle. This remains honoured in the breach, and the United Kingdom has no Women's Bill of Rights implementing CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, despite its being signed by the United Kingdom in 1981, ratified by the United Kingdom in 1986, and the optional protocol agreed to by the United Kingdom in 2004, meaning by ratification that the government is committed to advance, protect, promote and fulfil the human rights of women under all circumstances, including each and every provision of CEDAW, thereby giving an undertaking to incorporate the principles and the provisions of CEDAW fully and effectively into domestic law. This has not been done. J, women are vilified in the media, with online violence expanding exponentially and AI, artificial intelligence, presenting a potential for further exploitation and abuse of women and girls, a potential that is being realised. K, despite women and girls being more at risk from climate change, the destruction of the environment and the challenge to biodiversity are not being addressed with firm and clear public and private sector action. L, although some government action has partially addressed the vulnerability of the girl child through the prohibition of underage marriage, girls remain subject to sexual and sexist harassment at school and lack equal opportunities in education, career advice, sport, and other areas of life. So, 4, this Women's Parliament refers to the motions of the Women's Parliament passed unanimously. A, on International Women's Day, the 8th of March 2022 in Cambridge, England, demanding a Women's Bill of Rights incorporating all CEDAW provisions and general recommendations. B, on the 8th of December 2022 in Cambridge, England, during the UN 16 days of action to end violence against women, seeking the introduction of a Women's Bill of Rights and effective action to address, combat and end violence against women in all its forms. C, on the 8th of March 2023, International Women's Day, demanding action to ensure women's economic independence and to close the wages and pensions gap and to introduce a Women's Bill of Rights here in Cambridge, England. That Women's Parliament was held. D, on the 6th of March 2024 in Buckingham, England, during the UN International Women's Day month of action, demanding, amongst other matters, a Women's Bill of Rights. E, on the 27th of June 2024 in Sydney, Australia, calling on governments, trade unions and business to take immediate action to address, amongst other matters, the climate change and biodiversity emergencies, recognising the ongoing threat to life, well-being and health of all living beings on the planet. And F, on the 6th of December 2024, during the United Nations 16 days of action, calling for government action to honour its commitment to the Beijing Platform and Declaration, that Women's Parliament held in Buckingham, England. The Women's Parliament hereby demands that the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, CSW 69 in New York in March this year, demands that the United Kingdom government enter into a binding covenant that it will take strong and effective action to honour the 12 areas of critical concern in the Beijing Platform and Declaration so that another 30 years do not pass with women and girls not enjoying women's rights as human rights and human rights as women's rights. Further, this Women's Parliament demands that the government immediately upon its return from New York from CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women 69, first, introduces legislation establishing a Women's National Commission, WNC, with women's civil society membership as an institutional mechanism to provide policy advice to government, with regular meetings with the Prime Minister and Ministers of the Crown to ensure that women's voices are heard within government and the bureaucracy in formulation and decision-making. And further, that the government, immediately upon its return from CSW 69, provides legislatively based funding and resourcing of women's services in all areas of women's lives, including services for Black and minoritised women, trafficked and prostituted women, asylum-seeking and refugee women, women with a disability, and all disadvantaged groups of women, all women at all levels proper and appropriate for care, support, protection and advancement to independence of all women. And finally, this Women's Parliament demands that all governments, national, devolved and local, take a leading role in ensuring that within 12 months of this date and in any event on or before International Women's Day, the 8th of March 2026, a Women's Bill of Rights is introduced and passed by the Parliament, accompanied by consistent women's rights bills passed by the devolved authorities of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland and local government authorities around the United Kingdom to ensure that their policies and practices are consistent with the provisions of CEDAW and the general recommendations made by the CEDAW committee. And now we come to the most exciting part of the program. This Women's Parliament participants this year, the 4th of March 2025 in Cambridge, England, are Claudia Martans. Claudia Martans is a qualified attorney at law with a strong interest in international environmental law. She was admitted to the bar of the Republic of Panama in 1995 and has an extensive academic background in law and environmental conservation. She studied law and political science at Santa Maria la Antigua University and went on to earn a master's degree, an LLM, in environmental law from the University of Nottingham. Additionally, she completed a graduate diploma in law, GDL, at BPP University Law School, further solidifying her legal expertise. Claudia's passion for environmental protection led her to obtain a master's degree from the University of Antonio Machado, Spain, in Management and Conservation of Endangered Species, CITES. Beyond her legal career, Claudia is a consultant on various topics, including international conventions and ESG consulting. Ziyi Wang. Ziyi Wang is a Year 12 student at Saffron Walden College High School, where she studies English literature, history and French. And she is planning to study law at university and then train at the bar to become a barrister. She is passionate about human rights and international law and also about legal aid. She is fascinated by how legal aid is capable of providing justice for all, giving a voice and protection to even the most vulnerable members of society, especially women and children. However, the desperate lack of government funding for legal aid and the consequential limitations to this has placed on the which it has placed on the service has inspired Ziyi to write an EPQ essay on the subject and to be involved in it in the future. In her spare time, Ziyi Wang is an organ scholar at Saffron Walden St Mary's Church, which involves playing for weekly services, conducting and directing choirs, and learning a vast range of repertoire. She also plays the cello and the piano, and in addition, enjoys writing poetry, mainly about her identity and dual culture as a British Chinese woman, with poems published in anthologies. Linda Edwards-Shea grew up in a working class household in rural England at a time when there were few opportunities for girls like Linda to go on to have meaningful and satisfying careers. She is one of the lucky few of her generation of the 1950s born women who could study for a degree and become financially independent. Linda has a master's degree in physics and worked as a physicist and engineer for over 20 years before retraining as an actor. She notes that both the engineering industry and the acting industry are sexist and classist, and concludes that misogyny and classism are endemic in British society. These days, Linda is an elected councillor in the small market town where she grew up. She divides her time between endeavouring to improve local people's lives and trying to get her next acting job. Hannah Murphy has been a PhD student at the University of Buckingham, where she studied psychology. She has successfully completed her viva at the University of Buckingham, so at the next graduation ceremony, she will be Dr. Hannah Murphy. In her PhD, she explored the lived experience of dyslexia and the understanding of social inferences. She has a fellowship to the Higher Education Academy and has taught psychology for 10 years at the University of Buckingham, at Green's College in Oxford, and for Oxford Summer Schools. Hannah was also extremely obliging in the University of Buckingham module on the Citizens' Advice module, where students gained practical experience in interviewing real life clients. And for one of the assessment exercises, Hannah played the role of the pretend interviewee, the pretend individual who had come to Citizens' Advice or to the lawyers in order to have her problems addressed. And I thank Hannah Murphy in particular, as I at the time was the leader of that module at the University of Buckingham. Now to Rosy Greenlees. Rosy Greenlees OBE is currently the chair of Cambridge Constituency Labor Party and is the candidate for the Cambridge City Council by-election in West Chesterton. She is also the chair of the British Ceramics Biennial, an advisory board member of the National Centre for Academic and Cultural Exchange, and a mentor for responsible influence in the arts and culture. Rosy Greenlees spent her career in the arts and cultural sector, including as cultural strategy manager, responsible for the Mayor of London's first cultural strategy, and founder director of London Centre for Arts and Cultural Enterprise. She is former executive director of the Craft Council, a national charity working in a sector dominated by women and small business. Rosy is a strong advocate of the value of creativity and the arts to society, previously serving as president of the World Crafts Council International and on the government's Creative Industries Council. A lawyer with over 25 years' experience in common law, spanning commercial law, microfinance, corporate governance, and company secretariat services, Wandoo Aibangbee obtained her Bachelor of Laws, LLB, from the University of Abuja, Nigeria, in 2000, and an LLM, a Master of Laws, from the University of Dundee, Scotland, in 2005, and a Master of Science, MSc, from Birkbeck University of London in 2018. Wandoo has also obtained other certifications in contract law at the Harvard Law School, edX, and corporate governance at the New York Institute of Finance, amongst others. Wandoo is passionate about women and children's rights. She has used her senior management role in the microfinance industry to advance the cause of women and women's empowerment. She is currently pursuing a PhD, a doctorate in philosophy, centred around the custodial rights of widows. She is pursuing the PhD at the University of Buckingham here in the United Kingdom. Janet O'Keefe. Janet O'Keefe is an advocate for social justice, equality, and the rights of marginalised communities. With a background in science and healthcare, as a speech and language therapist, she has spent her career ensuring that those who feel ignored or silenced have a voice. She is deeply committed to championing the rights of women, children, and individuals with disabilities, drawing on both personal and professional experience in advocacy. Janet is also actively engaged in local policy, and she is standing as the Labor candidate for Queen Edith's division in the upcoming Cambridgeshire County Council elections. She believes in the power of collective action and policy reform to drive meaningful change. Rosa Zaraei. Rosa Zaraei is a recent graduate of the City University of London, holding a master's degree in international politics and human rights. Her research focuses on women's rights, civil disobedience, and the intersection of international law and social justice. She has explored critical issues such as gender-based oppression, the manipulation of cultural relativism in the human rights discourse, and the impact of authoritarian regimes on women's freedoms. With a background in criminology and international law, Rosa is passionate about amplifying women's voices, challenging systemic inequalities, and advocating for policies that empower women globally. She is particularly interested in the role of women in resistance movements and the legal frameworks that protect or fail to protect women's rights on the international scale. Natalie Turney. Dr Natalie Turney is a lecturer in company law at the University of Reading. Her areas of research are predominantly corporate law and policy and insurance law. She is the author of Deferred Prosecution Agreements and Directors' Liability, published in the Lloyd's Insurance Law Library, and a contributor to the forthcoming book, Women, Power and Autonomy, Rights, Respect and Representation in Law and Society. Natalie has spoken in the Palace of Westminster on the matter of directors' responsibility for corporate wrongdoing, and she attends the Women's Parliament to discuss representation of women and girls in companies and corporate policy. This year, 2005, Natalie will travel to New York City as a delegate to the 69th session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, representing Women's Platform Northern Ireland and the International Alliance of Women. Elizabeth Mae Gappi. Elizabeth Mae is currently pursuing a law degree at the University of Reading, with aspirations to become a legal research assistant and to further her studies by undertaking a master's degree in law. Proud of her heritage, she serves as vice president of her university's Filipino Society while striving to influence and enrich communities. Passionate about providing a voice for those who are unheard, Elizabeth Mae Gappi advocates for marginalised groups and strives to make a positive impact. Known for her dedication to empowering others, she hopes to inspire meaningful change and motivate others to do the same. Olachi Ordor. Olachi Ordor is a finalist law student at the University of Reading, keen to become a solicitor specialising either medical law or commercial law. Her interest in medical law stems from her interest in tort law, recognising how medical law encompasses similar themes like negligence. Furthermore, her interest in commercial law is further ignited by her involvement in the Committee for the British and Irish University Commercial Awareness Competition. With aspirations to pursue a master's degree in law abroad in America, she is committed to furthering her expertise in the aforementioned fields to successfully contribute to the legal ecosystem. Funto Ajijola. Funto Ajijola is a first-year student currently studying law at the University of Reading. After her undergraduate studies, she plans to undertake a master's degree in international law whilst training at the bar. Funto believes that advocacy runs in her blood, and she has always been passionate about the idea of giving voices to those who are voiceless, especially those in marginalised community. This is why she hopes to become a barrister who serves in international courts like the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. In her spare time, she loves to write about foreign affairs on her blog and read literary fiction novels. Aimee Donoghue. Aimee is currently studying law at the University of Reading and has future plans to pursue a master's degree in law. After finishing her education, she desires to begin teaching in order to pass on her passion for law to the younger generation. Aimee has always been passionate about women's rights, and it is very important to her to help improve representation for women in the justice system. Mahima Matikola is an international student from Mauritius and has future plans in qualifying as a barrister in England and Wales, as well as pursuing LLM, that is Master of Laws, degree in financial and commercial law. Mahima has always considered that despite being in the 21st century, the issue of gender inequality remains a significant concern in major countries. An example she notes is Afghanistan. Mahima hopes to one day be able to bring a change, allowing more young girls and women to believe that cerebral opportunity, it is, she says in capital letters, for everyone. And now I read the poem Fire by Nikita Gill. Remember what you must do when they undervalue you, when they think your softness is your weakness, when they treat your kindness as if it is their advantage. You awaken every dragon, every wolf, every monster that sleeps inside you, and you remind them what hell, you remind them what power looks like when it wears the skin of a gentle human. We are here today at the Women's Parliament with a range of gentle humans who have that power, that fire within. And now I call upon Rosy Greenlees to move the motion of the Women's Parliament today here in Cambridge on the 4th of March 2025. Rosy Greenlees.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It was in the 1970s, in my late teens and early 20s, that I first developed my feminism and politics. The 1970s were a continuation of the 1960s in the form of promotion of equalities and liberation for women, and in terms of sexuality and ethnicity. I marched against racism and for abortion and women's right to choose. But the 1970s also saw me working in a gallery. I was on my own and a male visitor exposed himself to me. The male director laughed when I told him nothing was done. The 1970s also saw the beginnings of a backlash fully evident today of a new conservative populism. So has anything really changed in my lifetime? Well, I'm going to start with the Renaissance and the artist Artemisia Gentileschi. Renaissance women artists were only allowed to practice in their male relatives' workshops. Their rights were restricted, and a lack of education denied them entry to the guilds and academies of that time. Women were basically dependent on men and expected to be chaste and modest. Gentileschi was apprenticed to her father, a well-connected Renaissance artist. She was exceptional in being one of the few who achieved some fame, notably in the Florence Academy. However, she was raped by her father's friend. Her father rightly brought a case against the perpetrator, but it was for violence of his property. She was his property. A public trial ensued, with Artemisia repeatedly tortured to extract what was her truth, and her rapist was subsequently jailed. But as a consequence, Artemisia became notorious. After the trial, she embarked on a series of paintings of Judith slaying Holofernes, which is an Old Testament story, and it depicts the beheading of an Assyrian general, Holofernes, by the Jewish widow Judith shortly after he had seduced her, which is probably a rather polite way of saying raped her. Whilst it's a common subject of history painting, which was very much a reserve of male artists, Gentileschi takes the violence of the scene to a whole nother level. She shows not the aftermath, but the actual beheading itself in a real shocking gruesomeness. Gentileschi is no longer the victim here, but the judge and the executioner, bringing her own reality to bear on this tale. This is no dispassionate observation. It's a hugely personal painting, and she is using it to empower herself. Roll forward to 2020, and the National Gallery gave its first major show in nearly 200 years to a woman artist, Gentileschi. They acquired her painting, which was a fantastic thing to do, but this edition increased the total number of works by women to 25 out of 2,300 artifacts. And even when in a collection, the records are gendered. It's always this woman was the wife of, the daughter of, not this was an artist in her own right. Women make up the majority of arts audiences. They earn a high percentage of arts degrees. However, there are still gender balance disparities in the arts. There are 70% of women artist curators, but none of the top most visited museums are led by women. For example, the Louvre, the British Museum, or the Met. Only 4 out of 25 top jobs are occupied by women. Organisations that receive more public funding are typically led by men. So the higher up the pinnacle of arts institutions you go, the less likely to see women artists. Although there is a glimmer of light in that if you leave London, you will find more women receiving opportunities to show and in smaller institutions. Working as a creative is a highly insecure occupation, and increasingly so. As a consequence, your economic and your social background increasingly plays a role in your ability to succeed. For a man with no other responsibilities, it's a different case. So why is this important, you might ask, when I should be talking about the 12 critical areas of concern, of women and health, of rights, of poverty? And the reason is because culture and our heritage tells us about who we are, our identity, our stories. Without what we know of the past and the civilizations that existed before, we do not know about these things. These are the artifacts and the images that tell us about that past. So I want to leave you with one other story, one more positive story of empowerment. The Pussy Hat Project is a global women's movement started in 2017, and it was set up by 2 creatives, Jana Zweiman and Krista Southe. And they conceived of this idea of creating a sea of pink hats at women marches everywhere. The name Pussy Hat was chosen in part as a protest against comments made by Donald Trump about the freedom that he felt to grab women's genitals. to transform the word pussy into one of empowerment and creativity. And as a consequence, Pussy Hat Project saw millions of women, men and children at over 600 rallies in countries across the globe, all wearing handmade pink knitted caps on a single day, marching in solidarity for women's rights. And this project was really inclusive because anyone could make the hat from a simple pattern, and it allowed people who could not actually participate themselves physically, whether for medical, financial or other reasons, by making a hat, wearing it on that day. This was a visible way to demonstrate their support for women's rights. Like the Gentileschi, a pussy hat now resides in a collection, in this case of the Victoria and Albert Museum, amongst other institutions, as an important part of feminist history. To quote the project, what started as a simple means of protest, participation and solidarity has become an iconic global symbol of political activism. Without women artists, we will not see ourselves in the future. And this is why I believe we must pass this motion. And now I move this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosy Greenlees. And now I call upon Linda Edwards-Shea to support the motion. Thank you, Linda.
It's 30 years since the Beijing Declaration that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights was affirmed as a key principle. Yet the United Kingdom still does not have a Women's Bill of Rights. Why is that? To answer that question, let's start by considering the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, commonly known as CEDAW. This convention was signed and ratified by the United Kingdom in the 1980s. Ratification commits the British government to advance, protect, and promote and fulfil the human rights of women under all circumstances, thereby giving an undertaking to incorporate CEDAW into UK law. So why hasn't CEDAW been incorporated into our law? I believe the reasons for this neglect are embedded in British society. We have to talk about the S word, sexism. Sexism is a prejudice-based ideology that promotes the idea that men and women are inherently different and therefore should be treated differently, not only by society, but also by those in authority over us, the so-called British establishment. The establishment holds sway over our political, cultural, social and economic processes and interactions. Even just a cursory inspection of our judicial system, our police, legislators, government, political parties, the church, our armed forces, media, cultural institutions such as the BBC, even our education and healthcare systems, all of these form a network of influence in what is known as the Old Boys Club. The Old Boys Club still thrives. The members of the Old Boys Club are self-styled elites who often share the same privileged background, even going to the same school. When people ridicule politicians for going to the same public school, then to Oxford University, then to the House of Commons and the Cabinet, thereby gaining influence and power, they're not joking. In the past, this was the norm for the powerful, wealthy, and influential to wield their power over the rest of us. There are still too many British parliamentarians who follow that route. As an outsider looking in, as a working class woman, it seems to me that the establishment consists of systems that are designed to keep us out rather than let us in. Examples include the 11+ exam and the reluctance of some members of the Anglican Church to accept women bishops. There are many other examples of discriminations based on sex and class. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that politicians are immoral, amoral, or unethical, far from it. I believe most people who become politicians do so because they want to give back to their communities. They want to improve the lives of others. I'm a politician in a small way myself. I represent residents in a small Lincolnshire town where I'm an elected member of the town council and district council. I work with councillors from all parties and none, and with the civil servants who are the ones who do all the work, often on low pay. So what has this to do with women and women's rights? An American suffragist, Helen Todd, gave a speech in 1911 in which she used the phrase, bread for all and roses too. That phrase was used a year later during a garment workers' strike following a new law that reduced the women's pay. It's reported that one of the striking women carried a placard that read, "We want bread, but roses too." Sadly, on the 29th of January 1912, a 34-year-old Italian immigrant garment worker called Anne Lopizzo was shot dead by police while peacefully picketing. She is remembered with the words, "Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses." The strike became known as the Bread and Roses Strike, and the phrase itself has since been associated with women's rights. The strike was ultimately successful in providing the garment workers with all of their demands, including a pay rise. The women were rewarded with bread. When we're lucky in who governs us, we get the roses as well as the bread. But it doesn't work at all if all we get is roses and no bread. We need bread to survive, but we need roses to live. We need both. The archetypal member of the British establishment is a man. Traditionally, men rule and they rule for themselves. Why wouldn't they? If men don't work alongside women, if they don't know what women are capable of, if they don't respect women or recognise our achievements, how can they fairly and equally represent our society? These days, the number of women in the UK Parliament is higher than it's ever been before. When John Major's government brought in the notorious 1995 Pensions Act, which was designed explicitly to disadvantage women, there were only 2 female cabinet ministers. Now, 30 years later, seeing female party leaders and female cabinet ministers is no longer shocking. In the 2024 general election, 40% of elected MPs were women, 60% were men. We have not yet reached the point where CEDAW will be incorporated into British law. However, more and more women are entering politics, and more men are working alongside those women to bring changes that will benefit women and girls. The backlash of rising misogyny that we see now is a sign of women's successful entry into the ranks of the British establishment. It's a slow process, and working class women in particular are still largely invisible. But women persist. We persist. I support the motion to fully incorporate CEDAW into UK law. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda Edwards-Shea. And I now call on Mahima Matikola to speak to the motion. Thank you, Mahima.
Honourable delegates, esteemed guests and champions of women's rights. It is a privilege to stand before you at CSW 69 here in the United Kingdom as we mark 60 years since Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, a defining moment that ignited hope, ambition, and a global commitment to gender equality. 30 years ago, world leaders declared that women's rights are human rights. They pledged to dismantle systemic discrimination and create a world where women and girls can thrive. That promise set the foundation for change, but today we must ask ourselves, where do we stand? Have we delivered on that promise? Have we truly secured equality, or are we still fighting the same battles? We have seen progress indeed. More women than ever before hold positions of power in politics and business. Today, 28 countries have women, heads of state or government. and women's representation in Parliament has doubled since 1995. More girls are in school, with primary school enrollment for girls reaching nearly 90% globally. Women are no longer waiting for a seat at the table, they are building the tables, leading movements, driving economies, and breaking barriers. We have seen landmark movements such as the Me Too movement, which exposed the scale of gender-based violence and forced institutions to reckon with their failures. In Rwanda, for instance, women make up over 60% of parliament, a testament to what is possible when policies support inclusion. However, the gender pay gap remains a harsh reality, with women still earning on average 20% less than men globally. Women continue to be underrepresented in decision-making roles, holding only 29% of senior positions worldwide. Additionally, we are witnessing a global backlash against women's rights. For instance, in Afghanistan, girls have been banned from secondary education, or in some other parts of the world, women still cannot open a bank account, earn land, or make decisions about their own futures. This is unacceptable. Beijing Plus 30 is not just a moment of reflection, it is a call to action. A call to every leader, every policymaker, every individual with influence to uphold the commitments made 3 decades ago. We cannot afford complacency. We cannot allow another generation of women to fight the same battles we should have already won. We must demand full implementation of gender equality commitments. We must defend bodily autonomy and push back against any attempt to roll back reproductive rights. We must push for economic empowerment, access to education, digital inclusion, legal protection, and an end to gender-based violence. We need action now. Governments must ensure that by 2030, the gender pay gap is closed. Schools must provide equal education opportunities for girls, ensuring that no child is left behind. Workplaces must be safe and free from discrimination. Women must have access to healthcare, including reproductive rights, without any fear or any restriction. To the young girls and women listening today, your voices matter. You are not just the future, you are the now. You are the leaders, innovators, and change makers. Do not wait for permission to take your place in this fight. Stand up, speak up, demand what is rightfully yours. We must remember, progress is not guaranteed. Rights are not permanent unless we protect them. Equality is not a privilege but a right, and rights must be defended fiercely, relentlessly, and unapologetically. 30 years ago, Beijing sparked a movement. Today, we must reignite that flame with greater force than ever before. Let CSW 69 be the moment history remembers as the turning point, the moment we chose courage over complacency, action over words. Let this be the decade of definitive change. We will not retreat, we will not wait. We are here to break barriers, we are here to build futures, we are here to win this fight. Together we rise, together we fight, and together we win. On that note, I stand by the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahima. And now may I call on Wandoo Aibangbee to support the motion. Thank you, Wandoo.
Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity. I'll be speaking on the girl child and 30 years post-Beijing. The advocacy for gender equality at the Beijing conference 30 years ago was next to none, with a key outcome to tackle specific challenges faced by the girl child, such as the rights to education, health, well-being, and the eradication of gender-based violence and discriminations. 30 years later, we reflect on this. Nonetheless, we must make commendations to the nations where significant progress has been made in education, health, legal rights, and the protection. However, the girl child has yet to reach her full potential in many, many countries, especially the global south, where she is taught to be compliant and discouraged from expressing her thoughts very early in life. While there are various categories that the challenges of the girl child can be discussed, I will limit this to education, empowerment, and the violation of the rights of girls who subsequently become women. Education is a foundation. It is not just academic skills, but it brings about exposure, confidence, growth, and job prospects, which are critical to a successful life. Education is a fundamental human right everybody should have. In the UK, education is compulsory for children between 5 and 18. And so you find boys and girls all having this education. But there are also a higher number of girls in the UK university, which is good. However, there are significant gaps in certain academic fields and leadership roles, as well as the need to address some social barriers. In sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East, UNESCO data has shown that girls' enrollment have increased, and this is commendable. However, while the data shows that there has been an increase, we have not been able to retain the girls in those institutions because they have to perform certain gender roles before they are able to go to school, which culture expects of them. We must continue to invest in education. An investment in education by my father and my husband has availed me the opportunity to stand here today, an opportunity every girl child will want. We go now on to empowerment. Empowerment is not limited to education, but includes access to finance, leadership positions within media, politics, corporations, and to grow and shift societal perceptions about what girls and subsequently women can achieve. It is well known that women that hold leadership positions in corporates and corporations have been seen to be more profitable than men. Millions of young girls across the world admire Malala. The Malala Fund, must be commended for providing platforms for young girls to become leaders in advocating for girls' rights and education and gender equality. Educated and financially empowered girls can make better decisions that can improve their life and the society in general. Political representation remains poor. Yes, we have seen subsequent improvements from 30 years ago, but today, in a country like Nigeria, we have only 4 women out of the 109 the 109 senators in the country. 4. And out of the 360 members of the House of Representatives, we have only 14. Within these 2 chambers, it is less than 4%. This sort of underrepresentation of women in the Nigerian Assembly is a significant issue, not only in Nigeria, but across other nations where women participations remain low. I'll now go on to the violations of the human rights of a girl. The girl continues to face most of the severe forms of human rights violations. I'll start with the female genital mutilation, which is done to young girls between infancy and adolescence, and sometimes adult women, in circumstances where parts of their body are cut off because of cultures and traditions. These violations are heart-wrenching. We have an estimated 230 million girls and women having gone through this. Also again in Africa, to prepare a girl for womanhood. Why are men not prepared for manhood? We spend a lot of time preparing the girl, teaching her what to do, telling her how to behave. Why do we not prepare the men? Yes, credit should be given to some governments who have done certain things to prevent this from happening, and governments who have signed the CEDAW, and the Nigerian nation who has also enacted the violations the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act of 2015. However, while these laws are existing, in actual fact, are they used for the benefit of the woman, and are they implemented? Domestic and sexual violence. We have about 84,900 women being killed worldwide in 2023. 60% of these women were victims of a husband, a partner, a family member. As a result of domestic violence, you still have sexual assault and violence happening and remaining justified. The continued violation of women's human rights is still a significant public issue that requires political will to end. And I'll also talk about the early child marriage. This is one of the most harmful practices that affects girls globally. Statistical reports that there are 12 million girls worldwide marrying before the age of 18 each year. As of 2024 in sub-Saharan Africa, it was 31% before the age of 18 and 9.4% before the age of 15. These are children. These are young girls that are learning about their bodies, are learning what life is about, that are being thrown into marriage. These girls experience complications from pregnancy, childbirth, such as hemorrhage, obstructed labor, fistula, leading to the global cause of death for the young girls who get married at this age. And lastly, I'll talk about human trafficking. This is a business that keeps thriving day in, day out. Human trafficking for labor or sex with a high premium for underage girls. Girls are easy targets as they want a better life or a way to escape difficult circumstances. 40.3 million people were victims in 2024, with 71% being women and girls. These violations continue to happen against girls who become women, and these are unacceptable. And we all must work to end this. As women, we must stand up to ensure that this stops, and as nations, we must continue to strengthen legal frameworks to address these problems. Work remains to be done to achieve gender equality for girls and for women. By empowering the girls and protecting their rights, we must invest in a future where significant contributions can be made by girls to the society. Madam Chair, I now move the motion.
Thank you, Wandoo Aibangbee. And now I call upon Hannah Murphy to support the motion. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Jocelyn. In 1995, at the United Nations International Women's Conference in Beijing, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was agreed to and signed by 189 countries, including the UK. It's been 30 years since the Beijing Declaration and Platform was created, and despite some government action in several critical areas of concern, many of which have been highlighted today, women still do not have equal rights. Last time I spoke about violence against women, with others who spoke the same message. But violence against women is a global issue, and it seems to have intensified. Research by the United Nations for Women and Girls suggested this is because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the current economic crisis that have highlighted the high prevalence rates of violence against women, especially in digital contexts, where recently women are victims of photo or video sharing, threats or imitation on social media platforms. And violence against women is still an ongoing problem and is still an area of concern. But today I'd also like to focus on another issue addressed by the Beijing Declaration. The school curriculum, women and girls still do not have access to education. The school curriculum is still weighted towards men's history and literature, and consistently more males study and progress in higher positions in science, technology, English and maths subjects. However, there are specific areas within education where gender disparities are more prevalent. Daniel et al. In 2023 concluded that there are concerning disparities in the identification of special educational needs in England. In 2024, Hood suggested there is compelling evidence showing girls are less likely to be identified as having SEND needs in education or special educational support. Women and girls are often overlooked. They're diagnosed later on in life, or they're often misdiagnosed with anxiety or depression. Research suggests it's because women don't fit the stereotypes of special educational needs, or they're not presenting their symptoms, but they're masking them. This almost feels like women and girls are being blamed for hiding their special educational needs behind a mask, just because they present differently. Eckerd in 2025 proposed that common estimates of the diagnosis of autism in the boy-girl ratio is 4:1. More realistically, the prevalence is more likely to be 2:1 than diagnosed with anxiety instead. Nash 2023 explained that autistic girls have more subtle presentations compared to boys, which contribute to their lack of diagnosis. The Child Mind Institute in 2024 have suggested that higher functioning girls often hide in plain sight, and they've called this the lost girls, as their symptoms are often misinterpreted. Autistic women refer to this mimicry as masking or camouflaging, and they report that this is exhausting. Keeping up the social mask is very stressful. They smile regardless of whether they feel like smiling. They engage with others even when they don't feel like engaging, and they continue to make eye contact, facial expressions, and mimic other social behaviours even if they're exhausted or drained, because this is socially acceptable. Socially, they do the right things. These women and girls are overstimulated. They may have meltdowns, but then they're called emotional or told that they want attention. So their experience and their emotions are both dismissed and criticised. This crushes what's left of their self-esteem. These women and girls have continued to pretend to be accepted in society, which is far more accepting and recognises special educational needs in men and boys. They continue to try and participate in education, which is weighted towards men's history and literature, and they will continue to mimic people to fit in socially because it's not acceptable for women to be rude. SEND diagnoses are often based on criteria for presentation in males, and this continues to be used in 2025. In line with what was agreed in the 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, should we not be exploring how special educational needs affect girls and women in their own right, and try and understand why girls and women feel the need to wear the mask and camouflage in a place where they should have equal rights to their male counterparts, who we seem to understand and forgive a lot more easily? With that in mind, I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah Murphy. And now I call upon Ziyi Wang to support the motion. Thank you, Ziyi.
Imagine this. There's a woman somewhere currently trapped in an abusive relationship with her husband, who is being physically and emotionally abused. She finally gathers the strength to take legal action, only to be rejected protection of the law and essentially protection of her life because she has no money. And as a result, she feels and becomes powerless with no ability to fight back. At this point, the ideal option for her would be to seek legal aid, a seemingly and promised accessible route to justice. But in reality, legal aid has become more and more out of reach for victims in these kinds of situations, with new reforms affecting women disproportionately, worryingly on the road to the conclusion that women's desperate needs for justice is being silenced. Vast numbers of women have been denied justice ever since the 2012 Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act, also known as LASPO, which not only drastically cut funding for legal aid, but also the eligibility criteria. This meant that all private family law cases were denied, almost all employment law cases were denied, and welfare benefits were practically removed, causing a dramatic toll on civil legal aid. And women account for 60% of these civil legal aid clients. Now, when looking at people who no longer qualify for legal aid as a result of LASPO, women outnumber men 6-4. Let's look at the scenario I introduced at the start. Facing domestic violence, that women should still be eligible for legal aid because domestic violence cases remain available. However, this is only if evidence can be provided for and accepted by the court. And obtaining this adequate evidence has created huge barriers to accessing legal aid in these situations. In fact, in 2018, during a series of interviews conducted by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, One participant described how because the evidence of her husband's domestic violence towards her was deemed as not recent enough, all the solicitors she applied for rejected her claim for legal aid, leaving her no choice but to handle the case on her own. But inevitably, without sufficient legal knowledge and still in a state of trauma from her husband's abuse, she lost the case, and her abusive ex-partner was awarded parental responsibility. This opens up another issue. Without legal aid, women are having to represent themselves at court. Indeed, until 2020, traumatized women representing themselves were even allowed to be cross-examined by their own abusers. How are they supposed to secure justice if this is what the law has put them under? While this was banned under the 2021 Domestic Abuse Act, a significant step forward, women are still able to be questioned by their abusers in some criminal and civil cases, and it certainly does not mean all women are represented at court. According to the Law Society, in 2023, 29% of domestic abuse survivors represented themselves, which is double the percentage pre-LASPO. These women, who on top of having to deal with long-term effects of domestic abuse, such as depression and anxiety, are also suddenly forced to fight for their lives in a courtroom they have no understanding of, with legal terms and procedures they have never even heard of, against their own abusers for something that has so much power over their lives. Needless to say, this results in low success rates, increased risk of losing custody, and increased chance of seeing your abuser receive nothing for the potential lifetime of anguish he left you. Where is the justice for these women? Where is the legal support that was promised? The government needs to improve women's accessibility to legal aid because it's the only way many women are able to seek justice. Therefore, I am in complete support of the motion because if we, as a society, still expect and believe justice to be a right for all, something everyone can use as protection, even the vulnerable and even the poor, then we must increase access to legal aid to make sure that justice is not bought, but justice is guaranteed. And as the worst affected social group from the LASPO reforms, let's start with women. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziyi Wang. And now may I call upon Janet O'Keefe to speak to the motion. Thank you, Janet.
Madam Chair and distinguished fellow speakers, today we gather not just to reflect on the past 30 years since the Beijing Declaration, but to demand action. 30 years is a generation, yet for all the words spoken and the commitments made, too little has changed where it truly matters, in the lived experiences of women and girls across the UK and the world. We know the statistics. We know that poverty still wears a woman's face, that single mothers, older women, and women of colour remain disproportionately affected. We know that the pay gap and the pensions gap persist, denying women economic security in both their working lives and in retirement. We know that violence against women is as rampant as ever, with domestic abuse, online harassment, and sexual violence still treated as second-tier issues. And despite 30 years of international commitments, our own government has yet to fully incorporate the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women into domestic law. Made decades ago remains unfulfilled. That is unacceptable. This motion is not simply a reminder of past failures. It's a demand for immediate action. It calls for a women's Bill of Rights to give CEDAW legal weight in the UK, ensuring that women's rights are not just aspirations, but enforceable protections. A Women's National Commission, an independent body with direct access to government, ensuring that policies affecting women are shaped by women. Legislated permanent funding for women's services so that domestic violence shelters, legal aid and specialist health services are no longer at the mercy of government cuts. This is not radical. This is not impossible. It is simply what we are owed. We must also recognise that when we fight for women's rights, we fight for everyone. Women are the backbone of our families, our communities, and our economies. When women thrive, societies prosper. When we address gender inequalities, we create a fairer, safer, and more sustainable future for all. This Parliament is about action. It is about holding those in power accountable. The government must return from the UN Commission on the Status of Women with a binding commitment to the principles in this motion. And if they do not, then we will not stop demanding it. So today, I ask you to support this motion, not just with words, but with conviction, because 30 years is long enough. The time for women's rights is not in another generation. It is now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet O'Keefe. And now I call upon Rosa Zaraei to support the motion. Thank you, Rosa Zaraei.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Sitting here and seeing women from different backgrounds supporting this motion has truly been inspiring. Today, as we stand together, I bring with me the voices of Iranian women, voices that have been silenced for too long, yet refuse to be erased. Our struggle is not new, it is the continuations of generations of women who have fought against repression, discrimination, and violence. It is the story of mothers, daughters, students, workers, teachers, and political prisoners who have endured unimaginable hardships but have never given up. For decades, Iranian women have lived under a system that seeks to control every aspect of their lives, from the way they dress to the way they think and speak. We have been denied the most basic rights, the right to choose, the right to be heard, the right to live freely. Yet in the face of these injustices, we have never stopped resisting. Women in Iran have always been pioneers of change. When our rights were stripped away, we fought back. When we were pushed into the shadows, we stepped into the lights. We have led protests, challenged oppressive laws, and demanded justice at great risks. Many have been arrested, tortured, and even killed for daring to stand up, but their courage has only strengthened our resolve. One of these courageous women is Maryam Akbari Monfared. She has spent more than 14 years behind bars for demanding truth and justice. Maryam's not just a prisoner, she is a symbol of resilience. Her crime, seeking accountability for the mass executions of political prisoners in 1988, including her own siblings. For her unwavering demand for justice, she has been subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment, denied medical care, kept in harsh conditions, and cut away from her family. Yet despite everything, she remains determined. Her letters from prison continue to inspire, reminding us that the fight for justice cannot be crushed by prison walls. The struggle of Iranian women is not just about personal freedom, it's about justice, dignity, and the future of an entire nation. A society cannot claim to be free while half of its population is oppressed. True liberation comes when women are no longer treated as second-class citizens, when their voices are not just heard but respected, and when they are given equal opportunities to shape their future of their country. Iran was among the signatories of the 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, committing to advancing women's rights in areas such as education, healthcare, and political participation. Yet nearly 3 decades later, these rights remain systematically denied. Institutionalized misogyny is not just a social reality in Iran, it is legally enforced. Discriminatory laws continue to restrict women's freedoms, from limitation on dress to exclusion from decision-making roles and systematic barriers in seeking justice. This ongoing legal oppression contradicts the very commitments Iran made on the international stage. We are not asking for favors, we are demanding what's rightfully ours. We are demanding the right to education without fear, the right to work without restrictions, the right to speak without censorship, and the right to exist without oppression. These are not privileges, these are fundamental human rights. But this fight is not just for Iranian women, it's for women everywhere. Oppression knows no borders, and neither does solidarity. We need the world to stand with us, to amplify our voices, and to hold those in power accountable for their crimes against women. Change does not come from silence, it comes from collective action, from speaking out even when it's dangerous, from refusing to accept injustice as normal. Today, as we honor the women who have sacrificed so much, let us also renew our commitment to this fight, to let us promise that we will not be silent, that we will continue to push forward, that we will never settle for anything less than full equality. Iranian women are fighting not just for themselves, but for generations to come. And with the strength of our voices and the power of our unity, we will win. I support the motion presented in the Women's Parliament today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa Zaraei. Thank you. I now call on Claudia Martans to support the motion. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this opportunity to be able to talk about women and climate change. So climate change is one of the most pressing ecological and environmental challenges of our time. Beyond its impact on the planet, it poses a serious threat to human rights, economic development, and global security. While climate change affects all of humanity, its consequences are not felt equally. The world's poorest nations, those that have contributed the less to the crisis, bear the heaviest burden. Moreover, its effects disproportionately impact women and girls, exacerbating their existing inequalities. Climate change exacerbates women's inequalities, such as low economic status, pre-existing disadvantages, and dependencies on natural resources, making them vulnerable to the effects of climate change. From slow onsets, disasters, to abrupt environmental shocks, the impacts of climate change affect women on multiple domains: displacement, education, food and water security, economic stability, physical and reproductive health and survival, mental health, gender-based violence, exploitation, and human trafficking. In terms of livelihood and economic insecurities, women represent a higher percentage of those dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods. Women farm around 45 to 80% of all food in developing countries, and most of the female force in these countries engage in agricultural work. Women farmers have less access to ownership of their farmland than men. Women are responsible for securing water, producing, gathering, cooking, and collecting wood fire. Changes in weather are constantly affecting agriculture and natural resources, with agriculture being the most critical employment sector for women. They must work really hard to secure income and resources for their families during periods of rainfall and drought. In terms of health, according to a report published by the United Nations Women in 2018, women and children are 14 times more likely to be killed or injured during a climate change disaster than men. This is because when a natural disaster occurs, long-standing gender inequalities that have created disparities in information, mobility, decision-making, and access to training and resources drive women's injuries and death. Food and water insecurity as well. In climate crisis, women are more vulnerable to food and water scarcity. Reproductive health, the direct and indirect effects of climate change, for example, heat, stress, extreme weather events, and air pollution, potentially impacts pregnant women and newborns' immediate and long-term health. Climate change as well increases the spread of vector-borne diseases like malaria, dengue, and Zika virus, especially in the global south. In terms of education as well, can be disrupted by climate change. Extreme climate-related weather events can interrupt education because of schools are destroyed or damaged. Then teenagers, girls do not want to attend school if sanitation and hygiene facilities are not available. Some families cannot afford schools, fees, or materials. Displacements of the families as well, and reduced capacity to learn due to malnutrition or trauma in terms of extreme weather events. Gender-based violence. Climate change causes food scarcity and increased poverty, and also increases vulnerability of women to violence within the household and their community. After a natural disaster, women and girls have to walk long distances to fetch water and firewood, exposing them to sexual violence. Displacement and exploitation and human trafficking. Climate change causes displacement, and around 80% of displaced people are women. When people are displaced, they're vulnerable, and the vulnerable people are at higher risk of being exploited. Modern slavery tends to increase after natural disaster or conflicts where people are displaced. So why is it so important to empower women? When women recognize their power within and act together with other women, they enhance their ability to act as a change agents. Structural empowerment is crucial to confirm their rights to work, to own property, to live safely, to exert their voices, and to experience freedom are essential. Advancing many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals like gender equality, eliminating poverty, decreasing hunger, combat climate change, and promoting peaceful societies, this will reinforce women empowerment. It is imperative for women to play a vital role in addressing climate change. Studies indicate that female leaders are incredibly effective in protection and conservation, and frequently pursue more sustainable future for their communities as a leader with women leadership. Societies are more successful in capacity building, strategies, and resilience when women are part of the planning process. In education, it's vital for women empowerment because it enables them to attain better jobs, reduces their poverty, improves their agricultural yields, allows them to have the number of children they want. Education as well is fundamental in planning for and responding to natural disasters and extreme weather events. Educating women and girls means also lower greenhouse environmental gas emissions, as when girls receive more education, they're more effective and resilient agents of soils, trees, water, and food. Empowering women in agriculture is increasing their ownership in land, would allow them more decision-making over the crops, choice, fertilizers, and sustainable farming practices. So one of the things that I wanted to mention, because I'm talking a lot about Global South, but in the Global North, there was a very interesting case out from the Association of Climate Senior in Switzerland, a case that touches climate change and human rights. So this case is a landmark action case of a group of Swiss senior women organized under the Association of Climate Senior Switzerland. They argue that the government's inaction violated their human rights under the European Convention of Human Rights, particularly the right to live and the right for private and family life. So in 2016, the association, along 4 individual women, filed a request to the Department of Environment in Switzerland, urging them to take robust action to reduce greenhouse gases in line with the Paris Agreement. The Environmental Department declined, and subsequently, the subsequent appeals to the Federal Administrative Court and the Federal Supreme Court were unsuccessful as well. So after they exhausted all domestic remedies, the applicants brought their case to the European Court of Human Rights in 2020. Of the court heard the case, recognizing its significance concerning human rights and climate change. The applicants contended that the Swiss government's inadequate climate policies expose them as elderly women to severe health risks from heat wave intensified by global warming. The judgment in 2024 found that Switzerland had violated the Article 8 and 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and the court held that the state's failure to take timely and adequate measures to reduce gas emissions constituted a breach of its positive obligation to protect the applicant's right, respect for their private and family life. The most important part of this judgment is that it established a precedent for holding states accountable under human rights law for insufficient action on climate change. It underscores the duty of government to implement effective and timely measures to combat climate change, to protect the human rights of their citizens, particularly vulnerable groups like women. So last year, as we all know, was the hottest year on record. And if the greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, the world could surpass the 2 degrees of warming as early as 2030. So without urgent action, we will face increasingly severe and frequent climate-related disasters, making women more vulnerable. So empowering women is crucial part of the solution. Women's distinctive social role and potential for representation provide opportunities to promote effective solutions for sustainability, disaster risk reduction, and adaptation of social and adoption of solutions. So for all of these, I support the motion.
Thank you, Claudia Martans. And now I call upon Funto Ajijola to present her submission on the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. International Women's Day is not a day of celebration for the singular woman. It's a day of celebration for the woman as a collective, the nurturers, the gatherers, the inventors of computer software and stem cell isolation, dishwashers and feeding tubes, and sending the first group of people to space. But women as a collective suffer as a collective. The relationship between women's involvement in establishing peace processes, gender-based violence and conflict, women's leadership in conflict and crises, and the access to justice during and after conflict is so delicately spun and interwoven, but spun nonetheless with the strength of steel. And it has gotten so much worse over the years. I'm unable to tell you why and how the idea that we should care less about the violence inflicted on women ever came into being. Because in the meantime, as we use proximity as justification to inhibit empathy, sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war. Women are being deprived of life-saving healthcare. Women are being abducted and subjected to intimate partner violence. Is the proximity argument being placed because Sudan is 5,442 kilometers away from the UK? Is it because Congo, another country riddled with conflict, is further away at 6,681 kilometers? If that's your logic, then let air miles and metric distances dictate how much you care about the state of women internationally. It will never change the pain experience when the hymen is lacerated due to forced penetration, the sexually transmitted diseases that can't be treated medically, the injury sustained to the breast, the rectum, and the mouth, and the life-altering PTSD that women experience as a result. Try your hardest to make that argument seem logical to any extent. The argument raised that eliminating violence against women should not be at the forefront of our minds due to proximity is absurd and it's insensitive. It demonstrates a lack of accountability and empathy, and it tells our mothers and our daughters and our aunties and our grandmothers that violence inflicted against them is normal. Yet the global crisis of violence against women and girls continues with few signs of abating. According to UN Women, more women live in conflict and crisis than ever before, with sexual violence and conflict rising dramatically, with UN verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence soaring by 50% last year to 3,688 cases in total, and the number of girls being affected by grave violations in situations of armed conflict increasing by 35%. Dying, not even at the hands of war directly, but because of the overwhelming shock coursing through your body because a man forcefully penetrated you to assert his dominance just because crazily enough he could, and he did, getting a sexually transmitted disease and not being able to even obtain medical treatment, paying the price for a man's war with the gravest violation of your body just because you exist. The fight for women's complete emancipation from sexual and gender-based violence involves a lot more work that has been already done. It involves putting women in cabinet positions, being held in lawmaker positions, in local government, and becoming heads of state. It involves humanitarian actions like funding women's local organizations and being fully supported by those in positions of power, giving women the chance to speak fully about what they want and what they need, not having their thoughts being dictated by what a man continually says, and having a man represent what we want. It involves putting the youth, and I mean young women and girls who have no idea that there are 100 different ways for their bodies to be forcefully violated, at the forefront of this ongoing fight. Because it's not a plea, not anymore. It's not a plea because initiatives like the ELSI Initiative and the ELSI Initiative Fund are helping to increase the number of women in peacekeeping roles. The number of women being represented in the judiciary has increased, seeing as in 2023, women represented 55% of the magistrates involved in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia, highlighting the importance of gender representation in post-conflict legal proceedings. Since 2010, UN Women has deployed more than 175 gender experts to every mandated human rights investigation, which have been pivotal in honestly documenting sexual and gender-based violence, which gives survivors a greater chance to access justice. And additionally, as of 2024, 14 countries have committed to apply a feminist lens to their foreign policy. So things are working. But as I said before, International Women's Day, which is being celebrated in 4 days from now, is not a day of celebration or reflection for the one singular woman. To celebrate the nurturers, the gatherers, the inventors, and quite frankly, the divine, we must unite. Violence against women is learned. It's the most unaddressed and pervasive human rights violation on earth, and it must end. And with this, I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Funto Ajijola. Thank you. And now may I call on Elizabeth Mae Gappi for her submission on the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a privilege to stand before you today as we come together to support such an important cause at the Women's Parliament. I want to begin by telling you a case. A Black female teacher, very hardworking, very engaging with the students, very high in her aspirations, wanted to apply for a higher position in her job. She wanted to apply for head of year. She appealed this to the higher board, and she ended up getting rejected because her application was not strong enough. She was told that there was a more capable white applicant for the role. She did sue the higher board. She did sue the school for it, for around £400,000, £600,000, and she won her case. Why am I telling you this? I want to bring the concern of women of color, migrant women, and children facing disproportionate barriers that prevent them from accessing fundamental rights, economic opportunities, and protection from systematic injustices. In the UK, intersectional inequalities persist, preventing women from accessing the same rights, opportunities, and protections as others. Women of color continue to face disparities in employment, healthcare, and political representation. The ethnicity pay gap remains a stark reminder that race and gender can still play a role in dictating economic security, with Black and ethnic minority earning significantly less to their white counterparts. For migrant women and children, the challenges are also significantly greater. Barriers to healthcare, education, and legal protection disproportionately affect those seeking refuge or asylum. Many migrant women fleeing conflict and gender-based violence encounter hostile immigration policies, making it difficult to access support systems. Moreover, a lack of culturally competent services leaves these women to vulnerable exploitation and abuse. Discrimination in the workplace remains a significant barrier for migrant women and women of color in the UK. Between 2018 and 2020, approximately 16 of migrants in the UK identified themselves as facing discrimination based on race, nationality, religion, language, or ethnicity. UK-born ethnic minorities were about twice as likely to perceive such discrimination compared to those born outside of the country. A report by the Trades Union Congress found that nearly 45% of Black and minority ethnic women felt as they were assigned less desirable work compared to their white colleagues. More than 32% reported being unfairly overlooked for promotions, with this figure rising to 45% among disabled Black and ethnic minority women. Furthermore, research highlights that ethnic minority women and migrant women generally earn less than their white counterparts born in the UK, reinforcing the economic inequalities and limiting opportunities for advancement. So what needs to change? There must be stronger legal protections and policy reforms. There must be economic equity. So those policies are needed to close the ethnic pay gap. There must be equitable education reform, as well as accessible public service. Culturally sensitive healthcare, education, and legal aid must be a priority to ensure no woman is left behind. There must also be representation in leadership. We must amplify the voices of women of color and migrant women in decision-making spaces, ensuring that policies reflect their lived experience. We must confront the crucial question: as a society, have we truly delivered on that promise 30 years ago from the Beijing Declaration? While there have been undeniable changes and adjustments and achievements, the reality is that not all women experience progress equally. It's been 30 years. Where is our Women's Bill of Rights? Our women's rights should not be privileges. They must be necessary tools for us to make our way into society. We are not only fighting or standing for our generation, our society now, we are also fighting for the generation in the future. We must empower those young children, those young women to also elaborate on our motion today. I support the motion. Thank you.
Elizabeth Mae Gappi, thank you for that contribution. And now may I call on Aimee Donoghue to make her submission on the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Domestic abuse is a term that is often used to describe a range of abusive behaviours. It can be physical, psychological, sexual, and even financial. So many people face domestic abuse, but it is still greatly ignored in society. The subject remains taboo, and survivors are scared to speak out for fear of being judged or worse, blamed. So many survivors have been asked why they did not just pack their bags and leave. In theory, it seems easy. In reality, it is not that simple. It often starts with questions. Where have you been? Who were you with? These questions seem normal. They seem innocent. There is nothing wrong with a concerned partner until things begin to escalate. Questions become demands. Demands leads to threats, and threats can lead to acts of physical and sexual violence. Psychological abuse and coercive control are often harder to spot. Victims often do not even realize that they are being abused. They see what is happening as normal. Slowly, they can end up being cut off from family and friends until they believe that they are completely alone in their fear. They may even begin to think that they deserve what is happening. This is not true. This is never true. In this situation, it is fear that prevents a victim from leaving their partner. The abuse often will not stop when the victim leaves. They will be stalked, harassed, and the risk of violence against them remains. Many abusers ensure financial control over their victims to try and make it impossible for their partner to leave. Escaping is made even harder when there are children involved. There can be enormous social pressures on women to keep their family together for the sake of their children. But this is a heavy price to pay. It can even cost some women their lives. Despite this, domestic abuse remains one of the most unreported crimes. It is estimated that less than 24% of domestic abuse is actually reported to the police. There are a range of reasons for this, but the fact remains that domestic abuse can be very difficult to prove. There have been recent changes to legislation, such as the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, but it still seems as though it can take forever to get a court date, and there is still scepticism around victims' experiences. Domestic abuse happens behind closed doors, which makes prosecution extremely difficult and leaves victims feeling unheard by the system that is supposed to protect them. If a victim does manage to get a conviction, then their abuser will either receive a prison sentence, a fine, or even a community order. While a prison sentence is appropriate for an abuser, a fine or a community order certainly is not. It has been said that there is a culture of misogyny in the criminal justice system, which could lead to men receiving sentences that are significantly more lenient than they deserve, especially in domestic homicides. Courts often only focus on one act in isolation, and in doing so, neglect to see the pattern of abuse that victims are subjected to. This cycle of abuse needs to be reflected in sentencing, and it is not when an abuser is let off with a fine or a community order. There also needs to be progress when it comes to the involvement of children in abuse situations. When a woman is able to leave an abusive home, but she has children, further complications arise. It seems unfathomable that a woman fleeing domestic abuse would be forced to share custody of her children with her abuser, but this is the unfortunate reality for so many women. Courts fail to consider the impact of domestic abuse on children and instead continue to force children to see the father that abused their mother and even them on a regular basis because both parents should have a relationship with their child. No child should have to fear seeing one of their parents. Women are already scared to walk alone at any time of day, to go on a run with both headphones in, or even just when choosing what to wear. Home is a place where you are supposed to be safe and to be free from those fears. Home is not a place where you are supposed to be scared. 1 in 5 women will face domestic abuse in their lifetimes, and what makes it worse is that the majority of them will not receive justice. For the sake of the women of the future, we must change the system. For the sake of the women of the future, it is time that something is done. For these reasons, I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Aimee Donoghue, and I now call upon Olachi Ordor to present her submission on the motion. Thank you, Ola.
Good afternoon, everyone. 30 years ago marked a pivotal moment pertaining to gender equality. The Beijing Platform and Declaration of 1995 illustrated the collaborative nature of various UN countries as they worked together with the aim of improving women's rights alongside gender equality. As we approach the 68th Commission on the Status of Women in New York, we will reflect on the notable progress that has been made regarding women's rights, while simultaneously addressing persistent challenges that continue to hinder this progression of women's rights on a broader, more global basis. Following this, proposals will be offered as to how to address these critical areas of concern. Since 1995, remarkable achievements have been made in advancing women's rights. To provide you with an overview, these include increased support for survivors of violence or abuse, improved access to education for girls and women, and the enforcement of statutes to combat gender-based violence. With regards to increased services and support offered to women who have endured and survived acts of violence, the implementation of lifelines and their accessibility in most countries today is indicative of efforts to provide support to women who have been victims of either violence and/or abuse. Similarly, more than 100 countries now have trained police with a specific expertise in offering counselling to these survivors. Additionally, improved access to education has become more prevalent for women and girls in Indigenous communities or for those that come from disadvantaged and marginalised backgrounds. Lastly, the Beijing Platform for Action sparked the need for a global stand to combat gender-based violence, with 354 statutes targeting domestic violence in particular having been enforced in over 180 countries. Notwithstanding the considerable advancements that have been made regarding the improvement of women's rights, Beijing Platform for Action rightly identified 12 critical areas of concern that remain an issue today. However, in interest of time, I propose we focus on the 4 issues that demand the utmost attention, alongside potential resolutions in order to address these issues. The first area of critical concern is women in power and decision-making. Even till today, there remains an underrepresentation of women in leadership positions across various sectors. Specifically, in 2023 alone, according to the Interparliamentary Union, women occupied an astonishingly low percentage of 26% of parliamentary seats globally. It is clear from this figure that we need to be intentional with the enforceability of quotas that either call for alongside demand women's representation in political leadership in order to see such figures rise. Secondly, women in the economy. Despite some progress, this area raises concern, as women still remain overrepresented in both informal and vulnerable employment, with 60% of women being in these fields. The existence of disparities in gender pay further helps to heighten this issue. To address this, thorough training on business registration processes and the decision to offer benefits, like access to bank accounts, are appropriate progressive steps, alongside the enforceability of safe transportation systems to and from work and affordable childcare for these women. To address the gender pay gap more specifically, employers should be given a duty to disclose pay gaps, with the failure to do so resulting in consequences. Thirdly, with regards to women in armed conflict and conflicts like war of aggression more precisely, hinder the advancement of women, with civilians, including women, being a specific target. In 2023, there was a 50% increase in the number of girls and women who lived in close proximity to armed conflicts, exemplifying the severity of this issue. In order to resolve this issue, actively getting more women to participate in peace processes can help resolve such conflict, alongside international efforts to hold perpetrators of such conflict accountable. The last critical area of concern that I will focus on is women in health. The gap between rich and poor countries in terms of infant mortality, maternal mortality, and morbidity rate, as well as the accessibility of services that work to address sexually transmitted infections like HIV and AIDS, remains an issue. An appropriate measure that could be continued in order to address this would be the implementation of mandatory classes or programs for policymakers and planners involved in the emergence of health programs to cover all aspects of women's health in order to continue increased life expectancy among many countries. Since the 1995 Beijing Declaration, significant progress has been made in women's rights, particularly in supporting survivors of violence, improving education, and enforcing laws that combat gender-based violence. However, challenges still remain, namely the underrepresentation of women in leadership, women in the economy, women in armed conflict, and women in health. By implementing the aforementioned solutions, it will be possible to further advance gender equality and make this a reality. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you, Olachi Ordor. And now I'd like to call upon Dr. Natalie Turney to make her submission on the motion and to lead us all in seconding the motion. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Chair, and what a wonderful honour it is to follow so many esteemed speakers today, many of whom have noted that 2025 marks 30 years since the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which flagged 12 critical areas where urgent action was and is needed to ensure greater equality and opportunities for women and girls. Next week, or towards the end of this week, our chair, the Honourable Dr. Jocelyn Scott, and I will travel to the 69th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, that is CSW 69. We'll travel along with delegates from all over the world, although it must be noted that those from the Global South have faced extreme adversity in obtaining visa access on this occasion, and therefore the importance of our voice representing them will be all the more necessary. We will travel to New York City to take part in the review and appraisal of the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and the outcomes of the 23rd special session of the General Assembly. But listening to the speakers at the Women's Parliament today, 4th of March 2025, looking ahead to CSW 69, it strikes me that it's clear that the 12 critical areas remain as critical now as they were 30 years ago. Women and the economy is among the 12 critical areas listed, recognising that economic empowerment of women is central to pushing the cause for women's peace, safety, security and rights.
Though women have come so far in advancing towards financial freedom, I find myself increasingly concerned about modern day rhetoric and our independence. 50 years ago, it became possible in this country that women could open a bank account and apply for credit and loans in their own name without the permission of their husband. That's either within our lifetime or most likely the lifetime of the generation immediately before us. The reality was, though that's 50 years ago, many women still face reliance upon their husbands or fathers as guarantors due to their low earnings. This persists today, with women financially locked out of opportunities and freedom because of their financial status. Now, many nowadays, I find in particular, are rejecting the notion of inequality, rejecting the notion that women and girls face this inequality. And some will refer to different regimes, legislations, rules, so on, as outright markers that equality does exist. One example, the Equal Pay Act of 1970, which on the face of it renders it unlawful for women to be paid less than men for the same type or amount of work. Well, the reality is, as many have mentioned today, and is contained within our motion in this Women's Parliament, that the gender pay gap continues to exist. It counts for birth and care-related career breaks. It continues to exist today as it did then. According to the Office for National Statistics, the pay gap in April 2024, not even a year ago, was 13.1%. Since 2017, employers have been required, should they have a headcount of over 250 people, to comply with regulations on gender pay gap reporting. Now, these requirements would not arise if the gap did not exist, if inequality did not exist, yet many will dispute this fact as fiction, as is increasingly common in the modern world. Financial freedom, though, and it's crucial to state, it's more than equal pay in employment. Many women take on the crucial task of leading the family home, whether raising children, caring for relatives, or supporting their spouse. This is daily, honourable work that does not earn a wage. For many women, even those with access to the family finances and charge to spend on the family's behalf, the money is not theirs to spend without wage earner approval. Many will look at this on face value and find some justification in the arrangement. Okay. Indeed, for some, we can acknowledge that actually that might work out perfectly peacefully. But tell me, what do we say to the women that find themselves forced into lifetimes of homes that become abusive because they do not have the financial means to leave? I want you to just pause for a second as we're reaching the end of today's sitting of the Women's Parliament, and I want you to think about what financial freedom means to you. Is it the key to unlock the door and be able to flee an abusive home? It might not be to you. Is it access to healthcare without needing permission from the holder of the payment card? Is it the ticket to education, to training? Is it the ability to put food in your own mouth, to help a friend, to start a business, to raise safe children, happy children? The growing anti-women rhetoric over the past years has challenged men to retrace their masculinity to a place that suppresses women, to move back to a traditional family home, except one rooted in a place of dominance and control. And there's a complete failure to see that financial freedom of women protects us all. There's much we need to do to support women facing a lack of economic independence. We must be more proactive in seeking to balance the gender pay gap and pensions gap, and we must continue to call upon the government to be more responsible, to call upon companies to take the initiative to be more responsible, to be more industry leading. We need careful attention to the payment of social security benefits to women, ensuring women's isolated access to their own financial support that cannot be siphoned off by others in the family home. We need funding for local and nationwide grassroots programs seeking to empower women to become better educated, trained and secure. We need to support and protect our women's rights charities, re-establish the Women's National Commission in the UK. We must be an active voice for women and advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. We is everyone. Not just us sat here today, not just women. We is everyone. But all this, everything I've mentioned, the things we can do to be proactive is not enough for all women. It's not enough for all girls. For women in poverty-stricken and war-torn countries where foreign aid, regional programs for assistance, micro-insurance coverage is vital amongst other things. Fundamentally, women must be educated about support available, particularly where access to tech is not an option in an increasingly tech-driven and reliant world. Women's rights are human rights. Women's freedom now is the freedom of generations to come. Freedom from exploitation, from abuse, from torment, freedom to do more than just exist, freedom to be safe, freedom to live. I support the motion and I invite everyone to join me in seconding the motion today.
Thank you, Natalie Turney, and let us now all rise to second the motion. I second the motion. Thank you. Thank you all. And in closing the Women's Parliament today, I thank every one of you for participating and being a part of this Parliament. And let me say this as women speak. Women's voices count. Women's voices matter. Women's voices shatter the bonds denying us the rights of our entitlement. Women's voices count, women's voices resonate, women's voices detonate the obstacles confronting us, standing in our way. Today we say no to the bonds, no to the obstacles, no to the patriarchal pretense that we do not count, that we do not matter, that we have no right to speak, that we have not a thing to say. We do speak, we do say, we do demand, we claim our right to live in the world, a world of peace, of trust, of caring, of commitment, of contentment. We assert our legitimacy in this world, a world that is equally ours to share, to nurture, to free from the patriarchal posturing that results only in global unhappiness, ill-being, fear, threat, violence, dissonance, disaster. We do speak, we do say, we do demand, we do deny patriarchal posturing that claims the right to rule the world. We speak up for women. We speak up for ourselves. We celebrate our right to live, to speak, to stand up for our rights. We speak for women around the world, demanding freedom, rights, equality, At this Women's Parliament, we honour powerful women. We condemn those who deny power to any woman. We demand that those in power stand aside for women who seek no power over, simply power for women to change the world, to elevate women to our rightful place as equal human beings, as persons of equality, as women in the world, as women of the world, as women changing the world. All of us to share, all of us sharing power here at the Women's Parliament. We speak for women everywhere. We speak to women everywhere. For women will rise. This Women's Parliament, sitting in Cambridge, England, on Tuesday, the 4th of March, 2025, is now adjourned. Thank you.